Once upon a time, in the bustling heart of a city that never seemed to sleep, there stood an opulent restaurant known for its glittering chandeliers, marble floors, and a guest list full of the city's wealthiest elite. Among the sea of polished silverware and designer suits, a young waitress named Emily moved quietly. Her simple black uniform a sharp contrast to the glamorous patrons she served. Emily was in her early 20s, with a kind face and soft brown eyes that seemed to carry the weight of stories untold. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a dreamer. Beneath her calm demeanor was a world of aspirations, though she rarely spoke of them to anyone. This wasn't the life Emily had envisioned. She had grown up in a small town where her father had taught her to play the violin. For hours, they'd sit on their porch, her bow dancing across the strings as her father's voice guided her through melodies filled with hope and warmth. But life hadn't been kind. Her father passed away when she was just 16, leaving Emily to fend for herself. The violin became her solace, the one piece of him she could still hold on to. It was a reminder of dreams she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. That night, as Emily refilled glasses and balanced plates of food, the air in the restaurant seemed heavier than usual. At the far corner of the room, seated at the most lavish table, was none other than Charles Radcliffe, a millionaire known not only for his immense wealth, but also for his sharp tongue and icy demeanor. Charles was the kind of man who believed everything could be bought or controlled. His presence was commanding, and his reputation for cruelty preceded him. To the staff, he was a nightmare patron. To the world, he was a ruthless businessman who stopped at nothing to get what he wanted. Charles was hosting a private dinner with some of his closest associates, men and women as wealthy and arrogant as he was. Laughter echoed from their table, though it was the kind of laughter that left others uneasy. Emily couldn't help but notice how he commanded the room. Every gesture, every word he spoke seemed deliberate, calculated. But there was something else in his eyes that night, a flicker of boredom, as if even his lavish lifestyle failed to entertain him anymore. As Emily approached their table to clear empty glasses, she could feel Charles's gaze on her. It was sharp, scrutinizing, and made her feel as though she were nothing more than an object in his meticulously controlled world. She avoided eye contact, hoping to finish her task quickly. But Charles, ever the predator when it came to asserting power, leaned back in his chair and spoke loud enough for the entire table to hear. "You seem like a quiet one," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Tell me, do you do anything interesting? Or is serving tables your one true calling?" The word stung, but Emily kept her composure. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed the egos of men like him. "I do what I need to," she replied softly, her eyes fixed on the glasses she was collecting. "Humility," Charles said with mock admiration, smirking as his guest chuckled. "It's such a rare trait these days." Emily forced a polite smile, her heart pounding. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. As she turned to leave, Charles's voice stopped her again. "Wait," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "You've got the hands of a musician. Do you play something?" The question caught her off guard. Her hand tightened around the tray she was holding. "I used to," she said after a moment, her voice barely audible. "Used to," Charles pressed, leaning forward with a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "What did you play?" Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of the room's attention on her. "The violin." The table erupted into laughter, though Charles didn't laugh. He tilted his head, studying her as if she were some kind of puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "How interesting," he said finally, his voice dripping with condescension. "A waitress with a hidden talent. Why don't you play for us?" Emily's stomach twisted. "I don't have my violin here," she said quickly, hoping that would end the conversation. Charles raised an eyebrow, a sly smile forming on his lips. "Oh, that's not a problem. This restaurant happens to have a violin for such occasions. Isn't that convenient?" Before she could protest, one of the restaurant staff hurried to fetch the instrument, clearly eager to please the millionaire. Emily's heart raced. She hadn't played in years, not in front of anyone, and certainly not in front of a man like Charles, who seemed more interested in humiliating her than hearing her play. When the violin was placed in her hands, it felt both foreign and familiar. She could feel the weight of the room's expectations, the mocking eyes of Charles's guests, and the cold smirk on his face. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the bow, her mind racing with doubts. She wanted to run, to disappear, but something inside her refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Taking a deep breath, Emily closed her eyes and let the bow touch the strings. For a moment, there was silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. And then the first note rang out. It was soft, hesitant, like a whisper in the wind. But as she played, the melody began to grow, filling the room with a haunting beauty that silenced even the cruelest of whispers. The laughter stopped. The smirks faded. One by one, heads turned, their expressions shifting from mockery to something else entirely. Even Charles, who had leaned back in his chair with an air of boredom, sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. There was a fire in the music, a raw emotion that couldn't be ignored. It was as if Emily were pouring every ounce of her pain, her hope, her defiance into the strings, creating a sound that was both heartbreaking and breathtaking. By the time she finished, the room was so quiet that Emily could hear her own heartbeat. She opened her eyes, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. For a moment, no one moved. And then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was Charles. His expression was unreadable, but his applause was steady, deliberate. The others joined in, though their applause felt hesitant, almost unsure. Emily stood there, violin in hand, her face flushed and her heart pounding. She had expected humiliation, but what she saw in their faces wasn't pity or mockery. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. As she handed the violin back and walked away, she could feel Charles's eyes following her. His smirk was gone, replaced by an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Whatever game he had been playing, it seemed she had changed the rules. And though she didn't know what would happen next, one thing was certain: this night was far from over. As the night wore on, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on Emily. She busied herself clearing tables and avoiding the lingering stares of the guests. Every few moments, her thoughts drifted back to the way the room had fallen silent as she played, the way Charles's piercing eyes had locked onto hers. She wasn't sure if it was the vulnerability of her music or the sudden shift in his demeanor that unsettled her more. In the back kitchen, the staff whispered about her performance, their voices tinged with awe and disbelief. "I didn't know Emily could play like that," one of them murmured. "She sounded like she belongs on a stage, not here." Their words felt like both a compliment and a reminder of how far she'd strayed from the life she once dreamed of. Emily didn't linger in their praise. She needed to finish her shift and leave before Charles or anyone else decided to drag her into more of their games. But as she tied her apron behind her back, the maitre d' approached, his expression tense. "Mr. Radcliffe has requested you join him at his table before you leave," he said cautiously. Her stomach dropped. "I'd rather not," she replied quickly, her voice firm. "I understand," the maitre d' said, lowering his voice, "but refusing him isn't exactly an option. You know how he is." Emily nodded slowly, though dread filled her. She wiped her hands on a towel and forced herself to walk back into the dining area. The restaurant was quieter now, the hum of conversation subdued as the evening wound down. Charles sat alone at his table, his associates having moved on to the bar. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I don't think I'm allowed to sit with guests," Emily replied, keeping her tone polite but guarded. Charles raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "I'm not just a guest, am I? Sit." Reluctantly, Emily lowered herself into the chair, her back straight, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she braced herself for another round of condescending remarks or subtle insults. "You surprised me tonight," Charles said after a long pause, his voice quieter than she expected. Emily didn't know how to respond, so she stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the table. "Do you know why I push people?" he asked suddenly, his tone almost contemplative. "Because most of them are exactly what they seem, predictable, uninspired, easily broken. But you," he leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You're not what you seem. Where did you learn to play like that?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father taught me." Charles tilted his head, his interest piqued. "Was he a musician?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice softening as she spoke. "Not professionally, but he loved music. It was his passion. He taught me everything I know." For a moment, Charles said nothing, his eyes studying her as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Then he leaned back in his chair, the smirk returning to his face. "It's a shame," he said. "That kind of talent shouldn't be wasted waiting tables." Emily's jaw tightened. "Not everyone gets to choose where their talent takes them," she said quietly. Charles chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "No, I suppose they don't. But some people find a way to rise above their circumstances. Tell me, Emily, are you one of those people?" His words lingered in her mind long after their conversation ended. She left the restaurant that night feeling more unsettled than ever. Charles's interest in her wasn't flattering. It felt like a challenge, as if he were testing her, waiting to see how far he could push before she broke. Over the next few days, Emily tried to put the encounter behind her. But Charles wasn't the kind of man to let things go. He returned to the restaurant the following evening and the evening after that, each time requesting her as his server. His demeanor remained as sharp and calculating as ever, but he began to ask more questions about her life, her past, her music. At first, Emily answered reluctantly, careful not to reveal too much. But there was something disarming about the way he listened, as though he were genuinely interested in what she had to say. She couldn't tell if it was manipulation or curiosity, and that uncertainty made her uneasy. One night, after the restaurant had closed and the staff was cleaning up, Charles approached her at the bar where she was stacking glasses. He placed a sleek black card on the counter in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "An invitation," he replied. "There's a charity gala next week. I'm one of the sponsors, and I'd like you to perform." Emily stared at the card, her mind racing. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because I think you're capable of more than this," Charles said simply. "And because I want to see what you can do when the stakes are higher." It wasn't a request, it was a challenge. Emily knew that accepting would mean stepping into a world she didn't belong to, a world that had chewed her up and spit her out once before. But there was a part of her, buried beneath the fear and doubt, that wanted to prove him wrong. After a long moment, she picked up the card and met his gaze. "I'll think about it," she said. Charles smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good, I'll see you there." As he walked away, Emily felt a mix of anticipation and dread. She knew this wasn't just about the music. Charles was testing her, and she wasn't sure what he wanted to prove, or why she cared so much about passing his test. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next would change everything. The night of the charity gala arrived, and Emily could feel the tension building in her chest. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress she borrowed, her reflection staring back at her in disbelief. This wasn't her world. The elegant ballroom, the sparkling lights, the well-dressed guests, they were all so far removed from the small-town life she once knew. And yet, here she was, invited by Charles Radcliffe himself, a man whose wealth and power seemed to make everything bend to his will. When she arrived at the venue, she felt like a fish out of water. The guests mingled with the ease of people who had always belonged in this world, their laughter echoing around the grand room. And there, near the center of it all, stood Charles. He was exactly as she remembered, cold, calculating, but with a hint of something darker lurking beneath the surface. He spotted her immediately, his eyes narrowing as he observed her entrance. "Emily." He greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm glad you came." "I didn't have much choice," she replied, forcing herself to smile. She handed him the black card he had given her earlier. "Here's your RSVP." Charles chuckled, though it wasn't kind. "Of course, I expect nothing less from someone as independent as you." The evening moved quickly, and Emily found herself swallowed by the sea of unfamiliar faces. She wasn't just here as a guest, she was here to perform. The orchestra had already played, and now it was her turn. As she was escorted to the stage, she felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She tried to steady her nerves, but the sight of Charles sitting in the front row, with that smug smile on his face, made her stomach churn. Her violin, the same one she'd played for so many years, felt heavier in her hands than it ever had before. This wasn't just a performance, it was a test, a challenge she hadn't asked for but couldn't back out of now. She took a deep breath and raised the bow to the strings. The first note was hesitant, like a fragile breath that hung in the air. But as she played, something shifted. Her music began to flow, filling the room with its beauty, its emotion. She poured everything into it, the memories of her father, the pain of loss, the dreams that had kept her going. And the room, that cold and distant room full of powerful people, began to quiet. Even Charles, who had been watching with that calculating look, seemed to soften. There was a sense of awe in the air, a collective understanding that they were hearing something special. As Emily played, she noticed the way the audience had shifted. No longer was she the servant, the quiet girl in the background. She was the center of attention, and for once, it wasn't because she was the object of someone's amusement. The applause that came when she finished was louder than she expected. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine admiration. And yet, as she looked down at Charles, she saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of anger, of frustration. The tension between them was palpable. After the performance, Charles approached her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were colder than ever. "You're good," he said, his voice low. "But you still don't belong here." Emily swallowed, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the violin back in its case. She had given everything she had to that performance. She had proven herself, not just to him but to everyone who doubted her. She had shown that she was more than what they saw, more than a waitress, more than the girl they could control. "I think I've already proven that I don't need your approval," Emily said firmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Charles leaned in, his gaze intense. "You might not need it, but you'll want it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I can offer you everything. The money, the fame, the power. You can leave all of this behind, this life you're pretending to have, and become someone who truly matters." Emily stood there for a moment, considering his words. The offer was tempting, but she knew better now. She didn't need Charles Radcliffe for his validation. She didn't need the life he could offer, built on manipulation and control. What she needed was to follow her own path, to live on her own terms. No, she said finally, her voice clear and unwavering. What I need is to be free, and that's something you'll never understand. Charles's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. But Emily could see the tiniest flicker of respect in his eyes, a grudging acknowledgement that she had passed his test. She turned away from him, her heart light for the first time in a long while. As she walked toward the exit, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. She had played her heart out tonight, and in doing so, she had taken control of her own story. The world might not have expected a waitress to make it this far, but Emily had proven them all wrong. She had shown them that talent couldn't be bought, and no one could dictate where her life would go. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Emily smiled to herself. The journey was just beginning. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never again let anyone decide her worth. And though she had won this battle, she couldn't help but wonder. Had she truly outsmarted Charles Radcliffe, or had she merely become another pawn in a game that was far bigger than she realized? Only time would tell. But for now, Emily was free, and that was enough.